Okay, Eric Beinhocker, I am so happy to be talking with you, my old friend.
Great to see you, David. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, and I want to go back to the beginning of our relationship. It was, I think, 2009 or so, and I had just, as the founder of a new think tank, new for me, I had managed to get a grant to hold an entire conference on economics from an evolutionary perspective without knowing anything about the subject. And I was feeling quite intimidated, staring up at the economic edifice, the edifice of neoclassical economics. And I walked into a bookstore in Durham, North Carolina, and there was your book, The Origin of Wealth, on the stand. And so I read it. It was like my first introduction, and it made me feel so good because that I had something to contribute. So, and then we got in touch, and you've been my mentor ever since. So I want to begin by expressing my gratitude for your generosity, basically, and your wisdom. And then to what this is basically about is an update 18 years after the publication of your book on the radical remaking of economics, evolution, complexity, and the radical remaking of economics. And that includes your new book, forthcoming book with Nick Hanauer, and also my current efforts with Dennis Snower, who we both know well, through Pro-Social World and what we're calling the New Paradigm uh, Coalition. So maybe you should just take your turn, our way of introduction, and we can thread our way through this very complicated terrain, basically economics, complexity, evolution, and the radical remaking of economics 18 years later.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction, David, and it's very mutual. If I've been able to help you in economics, you've helped me enormously in understanding um, ideas like altruism, cooperation, multi-level selection, and cultural evolution. So you've very much been my mentor on those issues. And I should also note that when you picked up that book in Durham, you probably, it's like most academics, you looked at the references at some point, you would have seen a number of your key works cited. So even before we met, you were influencing that thinking and work. And I've been really thrilled to see the way you've pushed it forward with both Pro-Social World and with our mutual friend Dennis in the New Paradigm Coalition.
Awesome. Well, let's see where to begin. I think that ah, um, one thing, and by way of preparing for this to bring us to some extent up to the present, and this is a good way to begin, your 2020 paper toward a new ontological framework for the economic good, in which you comment on Dennis Snower's work, this so-called SAGE framework. And SAGE stands for, it is Solidarity, Agency, Gain, and Environmental Sustainability. So I know what it is.
Yeah.
So anyhow, where you commented on this framework from Dennis Snower, SAGE, Solidarity, Agency, Gain, and economics. And what you say in that article is that whatever else we might think about the neoclassical paradigm, it is an integrative framework. I think you call it an ontological stack. And what's needed, and I think, and what you point out, that the SAGE framework kind of went part way, but needs to go further, is another ontological stack, another integrated framework. So I think there's two critiques that we need to make. One is against the familiar critique against neoclassical economics, but the other is what Dennis and I in our recent articles called diffuse pluralism. Many different perspectives that unfortunately don't cohere, as opposed to another integrated framework, another ontological stack. And I'd like maybe you could begin by fleshing that out, and then we can proceed to what that other stack might be.
Sure, and this gets to the question of what do we mean by a economic paradigm or a new economic paradigm. Since ontological stack is a rather awkward phrase that only economists or philosophers might use, a better way I explain it to my students is that you can think of an economic paradigm is like a nested set of Russian dolls. Whereas you unpack it one layer at a time, you find another doll inside the other doll, and so on. And and the neoliberal paradigm is like that, and as you say, is very coherent. So the biggest doll we can think of is the system of global capitalism run on neoliberal principles that that we live and operate in. And then within that is a kind of ideological framework that really shapes our politics and our policies. And then within that is a set of economic theories, which purport to be scientific theories, positive descriptions of how the world works with normative implications about how we might make it work better through policies and things like that. And then if you drill down to the next level, there's a set of theories about human beings, since the economy is made of people, human behavior, human social relations, and so on. And then if you get down to the very core, at the very bottom of this stack of concepts, are a set of moral ideas, moral philosophies. And in the case of traditional neoclassical economics and neoliberalism, they're primarily derived from a very narrow view of utilitarianism, with its origins in Jeremy Bentham specifically. And so the argument that I make is that if we're going to compete with that structure, which again, covers everything from moral philosophy to what we should do in politics, we need to construct something that covers the same territory and is equally coherent and demonstrably better, and particularly better in those middle dolls, the scientific dolls, which or layers of the stack, which the normative ideas hang off of. Because if you get the science wrong, the descriptions of how the world works, if your theory of how the world works is wrong, then your theory of how it might work better, or what we should do, is also going to be problematic. And so I very much agree with you that the kind of traditional sort of heterodox approach of let a thousand flowers bloom, although many of these different schools and ideas have interesting insights, the lack of kind of coherence or integration across them has been one of the reasons why they've failed to displace this kind of neoliberal, neoclassical edifice.
I found it useful to think about all of this in terms of the complex systems idea of basins of attraction. And as I was writing this series of articles with Dennis, I thought, when I had that personal insight, I thought, well, surely there must be a literature on this. Someone must have related Kuhn's concept of paradigms to basins of attraction. And I found very little. So what do you think about thinking of what you just said? Is there any added value for bringing in the concept of alternative basins of attraction?
Well, I think, perhaps at a kind of more metaphorical level, there is that we do get sort of, stuck in one set of kind of ideas and frameworks, and it's very hard to get out of that and into something else.
Incremental change being a problem.
Yeah, and now I think when we're thinking about what we're calling the economic paradigm, we have to be a bit broader than Kuhn. Kuhn was primarily writing about scientific paradigms, and they're different in the following way. They're different both in a kind of scientific sense, but also in a sort of more political and philosophical sense. So, if your theory of gravity is wrong, the universe doesn't care or doesn't behave any differently. It's just just wrong in some way. But if your theory of economics is wrong and you're taking actions in the world based on that, you're actually changing the economy. So, this is what George Soros famously called reflexivity, that our ideas and theories actually feed back to affect the system that we're trying to understand itself in a feedback loop. And so, that also means that because our theories imply actions, should we cut taxes for rich people? Should we raise wages for workers? And those kinds of questions have, immense political consequences and political economy consequences and fights for power. So, you don't have billionaires fighting over the physics narrative or the biology narrative, but you do have them fighting and funding, campaigns around the economic narrative because it affects, their status and wealth and so on. So, what we're wrestling with is, something that stretches, from science and philosophy all the way into questions of power and narratives and politics.
Well, I might add that actually push back a little bit that, people in power and so on and so forth might well end up arguing over the physics because that is at the core of their um, beliefs and ultimately that does, the ultimate justificatory framework. Well, let's talk about the new core then, and presumably it is based on a combination of complex system science and evolutionary science, true to the subtitle of your book. Where do you think that stands at present? Complex system science and evolutionary science as the new foundation. I have my own ideas on that, which I'm going to share soon enough. But interested for you to begin as to how has that developed over a period of 18 years?
So I think, I characterize this on the one hand, very encouraging and very exciting. And on the other hand, still a distance to go. I think since my 2006 book was written, we've had a very large body of research emerge out of that community on all sorts of issues, from understanding the 2008 financial crisis and what happened after that, to work on climate change and the energy transition, work on economic inequality and so on, and economic growth and development that has been both different in very substantial ways from the traditional approaches and has yielded genuine new insights. And also, I think that community has tried to adopt a true scientific culture and be very driven by data and empirical testing, and not just sort of the stylized models of making assumptions and then playing with the math, which unfortunately characterized a lot of economic theory for a long time. And we're starting to see some impact from that work in the wider world. So, for example, work my group did on financial system stability had a lot of interest from central banks and financial regulators. Work we're doing now on climate change, we're in constant dialogue with policymakers. So the policy community has actually been much more open to this new work, I'd say, than many of our academic colleagues have been. And I think this is because the policymakers have to deal with real world problems. And so they want stuff rooted in good empirics and data. And they've also seen, how a lot of the traditional models, did not deliver what they needed. But the academic community has kind of had a bit more of a mixed record in adopting these ideas, particularly in very mainstream economics academic departments and journals. There's been some folks interested in exploring these ideas, but many others who simply aren't. But I like to say that in some ways, economics is being reinvented around some of these more kind of orthodox economists, because a lot of this work is being done by people in other fields, ranging from people in the physical scientists. In my group, we have a number of physicists and mathematicians, sociologists, political scientists, psychologists, anthropologists. We're getting contributions from all of these fields.
Well, I mean, one point I'd like to cover is that behavioral economics, although there's much to like about it, in many ways, it's still orbiting around neoclassical economics, and that's what's needed goes beyond behavioral economics. Behavioral economics is experimental. That's great. It relaxes assumptions about Homo economicus, humans, not econs, all of that. But at the end of the day, it's still very individualistic. It results in modifications of the standard, what you call utility maximizing framework. Is not systemic. I mean, the keyword nudge, I think, almost says it all, as if we can just tweak things and make them work better, when in fact, what's called for system level adaptation is system level selection. I mean, that's a very elementary thing. So that's my stance, and I just wonder if you agree with it or if you'd like to build upon it.
Yeah, so again, we always have to be careful painting with too broad a brush because I've met many behavioral economists doing very interesting work that I think you would also agree is in the kind of line of thinking that you described. But I'd say as a broad brush picture, behavioral economics has been very successful in landing an empirical critique of the utility maximizing model. It's been less successful than getting an alternative into the kind of bloodstream and models of economists. So you have this kind of a bit of cognitive dissonance, where you'll have the same economists, agreeing and celebrating the behavioral economics critique, but then, using a model that has a, far-sighted, utility maximizing agent at its core. I'd say at the same time, though, there's been a real revolution in behavioral science more broadly. And if you start looking across, some of the work being done in, experimental and social psychology, cognitive science, neuroscience, neurobiology, and a lot of the anthropological literature, you find a quite coherent picture of human behavior and human nature emerging, and also, and you know this through your work, a lot of deeper understanding of kind of what is sort of more universal, instinctive, may have evolutionary, biological roots, and then what is sort of more culturally determined and part of our cultural evolution. And I think economics could learn a lot from that broad body of work.
Well, I mean, I often say that what's taking place is historians will call it fast, but to us it appears slow. And I think just to focus on my own disciplines, and you look, for example, 20 or 30 years ago, we had two bodies of thought. One was called evolutionary psychology, and the other was the Richardson Boyd tradition of cultural evolution, very different from each other. And they've grown together. So now, on the one hand, we have as you say, rapidly developing body of knowledge about human psychology, which does not exclude the tremendous open-ended flexibility of our culture. Quite the contrary, it's what enables it.
Exactly.
And so the early division that was made between evolutionary psychology and what was then called the standard social science model is now, thank heavens, has changed so that we can acknowledge a culture basically as an evolutionary process, as an inheritance system, and that provides so much more scope for what we construct, basically. And so that's the kind of progress that's being made within the evolutionary biological community. But I want to focus on the complex system science, these two foundations, really, general complex system science and evolutionary science as the new foundation, as their integration being a work in progress. And let me maybe just give you my boilerplate on this, and then have you comment on it. First of all, new for different reasons. So complex system science new because it required the advent of widespread computing. Evolutionary science new because the study of evolution was restricted to genetic evolution for so long and didn't really broaden out what we now call generalized Darwinism until about the 1970s. So we have really two bodies of thought, new for different reasons. And complex system science, I'm happy to call it more general because it covers more both living and non-living complex systems, but living complex systems are so different. They need their own theory, evolutionary science. And what I find in my experience is that in part because general complex system scientists are frequently physicists, so I mean they're really rooted in general complex systems theory, which can be um, um, a good thing. It's the same problem that we talk about with neoclassical economics being rooted in Newtonian physics, not evolution, Newton, not Darwin. In the case of complex system science, it's no longer Newton, but it's still rooted in complex physical systems, and so therefore fails to address some things that are really distinctive about living systems, evolutionary systems. For that, we need evolutionary science. And all of this is contained, I'm going to stop soon and give you your turn, uh, um, in the key phrase complex adaptive systems, which, as like you know my work, but for the benefit of our audience, has two meanings. One is a complex system that's adaptive as a system, and the other is a complex system composed of agents following their respective adaptive strategies. And my experience is that those two meanings are thoroughly intermixed, when in fact the whole goal of policy is to turn complex systems that are merely agents pursuing their adaptive strategies into complex systems that are adaptive as a system. And as a demonstration of that, my colleague Guru Madhavan and I typed in complex adaptive system as a search term and got over 1,000 hits. And then we typed in complex maladaptive system as a search term, and we got 0 hits.
Oh, really?
0 hits. And yet we know that what we call wicked problems are nothing other than a complex maladaptive system. So there's a lot of uncertainty and confusion as to the distinction between a system that's adaptive as a system and one that's merely composed of adaptive agents. They're both complex, they're both highly interdependent, they both are, frequently out of equilibrium, they both have multiple level basins of, so the whole kind of conceptual toolkit of complex system science applies to both. But the distinction, that's a specific evolutionary question. You need multi-level selection theory to make that distinction. And so all of this to me are points that need to be made among the experts. So integration still in progress among the experts. And I just want that to take place as fast as it possibly can. So with apologies for mansplaining all of this, I'm eager for you to take your turn.
No, sure, and no, you're right to focus on this because I think it's an important issue and hasn't been kind of teased apart in the way that you described. And I think that's just a function of history that you've had kind of two different intellectual communities working in sort of related spaces and even sometimes at the same institutions, like at the Santa Fe Institute, you'd have representatives from both those communities, but it hasn't quite gelled together in a coherent way, particularly for social systems. I mean, the way I would think about it is, first of all, we have to recognize that evolution is operating at multiple levels in multiple ways in the economy. At a base level, we have biological evolution with multi-level selection, shaping the kind of behavioral patterns and instincts that are sit at the base of a lot of economic phenomena, such as our pro-sociality and our ability to cooperate, which my current work, I argue, is the kind of foundation of economic growth and development. Up to the next level of the economy is a kind of subset of our cultural evolution. Our institutions, our technologies, have quite literally evolved over time in a process of cultural evolution. And if you look at then sort of kick up a level, as I describe in the 2006 book, you have the co-evolution of what I call our physical technologies and our social technologies. then leading to these kind of emergent system behaviors of, economic growth and development, or economic inequality, or, carbon emissions and climate change. And those macro phenomena are all best understood as emergent phenomena out of these lower level interactions. And this is where complex system science has a lot to say. Is it's one of the ways of characterizing it is a study of emergent phenomena where you can't see the macro patterns in disaggregated micro behavior, that they're collective system patterns. And also, another characteristic of complex adaptive systems is they're open energy systems with, energy flowing in, creating order, and exporting disorder. And that frame is also fundamental to understanding the economy and why energy is so important in economic development, why we're having such issues with climate change and environmental damage, that the economy, is a thermodynamically open system. One of my colleagues has a good metaphor, saying you can think of the economy as the metabolism of civilization. With energy coming in, creating the order that we see in our civilization, and then the result.
Well, the whole it's not a metaphor. The whole concept of society as an organism, of course, stretches way back to antiquity. And now I think is really, for the first time in the history of ideas, we could actually, we're working towards a scientific theory of supra individual organisms.
So you have these, three intellectual traditions, evolutionary tradition, the far from equilibrium, self-organizing open energy systems, tradition that goes back to Prigogine, and then the kind of complex systems of emergence framework. All three of those, come together as part of this description of the economic system.
I think the basic distinction between proximate and ultimate causation in evolutionary theory, elaborated as Tinbergen's 4 questions, function, history, mechanism, development, is important here, because often and understandably, complex system science dives into proximate mechanisms of these complex systems. So the ultimate causation part is that if we want to select systems that work well, we actually need to create variation, selection, replication processes. And that is a somewhat of, and the raw material of that are the mechanisms of complex systems. So you obviously need both, but to implement a variation, selection, replication process at multiple scales and multiple contexts is complementary to an understanding of the mechanisms that you are selecting by that process. And so I look forward to the day when that distinction, which is like totally basic to evolutionary science, proximate and ultimate causation, actually is at the forefront of everyone's mind when we set about evolving our complex systems. I want to end, Eric, by asking you to describe going beyond SAGE. In your 2020 paper. You see, first of all, you praise the SAGE framework, and then you suggest ways of expanding upon it, and then to say a little bit about your new book with Nick Hanauer, which is your next major statement with him.
Yeah. So Dennis's SAGE framework, is I think an excellent contribution to this question of metrics and how we should measure the economy, and what is a healthy or successful economy. And there's now a very well established literature on critiques of GDP and other conventional measures of that. And as you know, Dennis is leading some important work to look at those alternatives. I think one of the key things in that is we need measures both at the system level, but then also that connect in some direct way to ideas of human well-being. Because again, what's the point of the economy? It's to promote human well-being and enable us to live, flourishing and fulfilling lives. I've always been a fan of Amartya Sen's work, in looking at, thinking of the economy as by giving us the capabilities to, live life to your potential, which is his definition of freedom. And there's some fantastic work now, understanding, what in a material way, actually contributes to human well-being. And so I think, it's a very rich area of work. And this is a little bit different than the kind of happiness research, which some listeners might be familiar
if I
with.
could butt in, Eric, I mean, the focus on happiness, even elaborated uh, um, focus on happiness, it's all about proximate mechanism, the psychological state. And what you need to do on the outside, starting with the environment and proceeding to the human constructed environment, in order for flourishing to exist in a psychological state, obviously. So the proximate ultimate distinction that I made earlier is needed right here.
Yes.
Anything that focuses only on one psychological state isn't getting ultimate causation.
Yeah, exactly. And also, I think there's a deeper understanding now that, what would be characterized as kind of long-term well-being or human flourishing is a much more kind of multi-dimensional, set of psychological states over time, and directed by multiple goals. It's not as simple as I eat ice cream and I feel happy, for this moment. But so I think that's a very rich area for more work and discussion about how we, bring those two lines of thinking together. On your second question, in some ways, the book Nick Hanauer and I are working on could be described as if what David Sloan Wilson has been saying for decades about human behavior and multi-selection is correct. What does it mean for economics? So we take the ideas that you and others, and figures like E.O. Wilson, for example, have developed very, very seriously, and build up what we call a new story of human progress. Which talks about pro-sociality and cooperation as being at the very very foundation of that, and then how that connects with an evolutionary view of institutions and technologies that has enabled increases in human well-being and human flourishing over time. Now, it's obviously been far from what we call progress. Has been far from a monotonic process, with lots of ups and downs and nonlinearities, and also lots of inequities in it as well. So we argue that by understanding progress and prosperity in this different way, that we can then get insights into how we can promote it, make it available to more people in the world, and also make it consistent with the ecological limits and boundaries of our planet.
And you use the key phrase "market humanism," I believe, is your key phrase. And so, what's the market part of that? You put market in as one of the two words.
We do see a critical role for markets in the economic system and in this kind of historical story of progress, but it's a different role than is conventionally understood in economics. So, traditionally, economics is viewed markets as this kind of optimal allocator of society's resources, and efficiency is the kind of key concept there. Building off of my earlier book, we view markets as actually, an institutional mechanism to promote evolution. That it's a mechanism for creating variation, selection, and replication or amplification of good economic designs and ideas and technologies. And so we focus more on effectiveness at promoting economic evolution and experimentation. But we also, this changes the conversation about how markets should be governed and regulated. Markets are human social creations. They're not a state of nature governed by physical laws. They're human creations. They themselves, as an institutional or social technology, have evolved over time. And so saying that in essence we should have a kind of form of directed or sometimes bounded evolution makes sense. That we want markets to serve human purposes. People don't work to serve markets; they should be working to serve us. And so, in evolutionary language, shaping the fitness function that markets are adapting toward is a socially legitimate concept, particularly in a democratic society where there would that there is some legitimate mechanism for shaping that fitness function, and that the traditional trade-offs of economic efficiency, positive neoclassical theory, actually don't really exist. There's not much evidence for them, and that they're often used actually really as stories to scare people into doing things that would take power and wealth away from the wealthy and powerful. So the basic theme is, we should be understanding markets in this new and different way, and then seeing how we can harness the amazing power that they actually have toward the broad purposes of society.
That's perfect, Eric. I'm totally aligned with that as far as I could tell. So that's a great way to end. Thank you. Thank you so much. I know that you're going to be hosting a seminar right now, so you have to rush off, but thank you very much for taking the time for this great conversation.
It's a pleasure, David, and thanks for all the work you're doing to develop and spread these ideas.
Great. You too. Bye-bye.